Okay, so now we're going to get into a couple of sections where we're going to talk about some very recent um, political events that have happened in Britain. They really revolve around uh, a couple of referendums and a couple of elections specifically. And usually I don't like to go into a lot of election discussions. I reserve those, especially like in U.S. history classes, just for elections that are particularly pivotal or had some element to them that were, unique, that changed the course of history, something like that. And so these were a couple of events starting in 2014 here with the Scottish referendum that were pivotal, and will and kind of show you where the UK is. And so this is 2014, so we're looking at um, just the last 6 years or so that all this has been happening. Some of it was brewing before then, but I wanted to give you a couple of examples. So the 2014 referendum, this was negotiated in 2012, and this was the Scottish Parliament being led by the Scottish Nationalist Party, the SNP, which is particularly dominant in Scotland. Not completely dominant. There are some areas that are that vote differently, but the SNP is pretty strong there, and they are able to push the parliament there to pass a law that says that they want a referendum, and they're able to negotiate it with the English government that they're going to actually make it happen. And so they are. I always have to check my notes to make sure I say this right, because it gets a little bit confusing, because they want people to vote yes or no, and it's like yes to what and no to what. And that was one of the challenges of especially in the early part of the campaign, is like, what am I voting for? Am I voting yes to stay, or yes to go, or no to stay? It was could have been better, maybe, and a better way of delineating what you're voting for. But the yes vote meant yes, we are going to leave. So the vote was, should Scotland stay part of the UK? Well, that would be a big blow to the UK if, previously the last time something like that happened was when Ireland seceded in 1922, or 5/6 of Ireland. And so now, if another chunk of the UK decides to not be part of the UK anymore and be a separate country, then that could be a real, blow to what you think of as this the British Isles being one unit, except for the 5/6 of Ireland. And so that's what they're voting on. Are there enough people in Scotland to say that they want to break away? Remember, this is part of Parliament is able to do this in Scotland because of devolution, which we talked about earlier, as something that had begun in the 90s and has continued on. One of the interesting things about this particular vote was that all EU and British Commonwealth citizens, so even if you're not just straight up British, but you're in Scotland, you're an EU citizen, and they also included 16-year-olds plus. So a 16-year-old, 17-year-old for the first time is able to vote in this election, which is pretty unusual. That's usually voting isn't extended to people that young. And the issues are going to be many. We'll talk about those in just a second. Currency. What is our currency going to be? Are we going to go with the euro, or are we going to be allowed to use the euro? They would have to join the EU separately. How is our healthcare going to work if we break away from the NHS? Can we provide our people? Do we have the resources to provide our people with an equivalent to the NHS, et cetera, et cetera? And so here's how the vote broke down. I pulled some of these graphics that you see, and a few of the maps that you'll see here coming up. Those are pulled from the BBC. They do a good job of, after elections, of compiling information into a way that you can see it well, and so that's what we're doing here. So the no vote, which means better together or we want to stay with the UK, was 55% of the vote. And the yes vote was 44% of the vote. So 2 million to 1.6 million. So not a complete wipeout, but definitely a clear victory for the people who want to stay in the UK. And it was a very high turnout referendum. So 84% turnout. So that's quite high in any election. Except in Australia. Australia has compulsory voting. If you ever are interested in voting items, check out voting in Australia. That is a whole different animal. When everybody has to vote by law, that's a different type of thing. Just want to make sure I covered this correctly. Yeah. So 5,579 polling stations and 32 local areas end up being delayed due to weather, because in Scotland, gray is a color, damp is a color. And so in the Orkney Islands, which is the very, very tip top of Scotland, the airport was closed due to fog, and so they actually had to transport some of the votes by boat. And so there is some challenges, but they do make it happen. And the UK was kind of on pins and needles. Everybody's watching the returns on this particular referendum because it's kind of a big deal for a chunk of the country to decide if it's just going to up and leave. And here is the general breakdown. So areas, I just want to make sure I tell you correctly. Yeah, so the places like Glasgow and Dundee, they were the areas that were particularly heavy in the yes votes. I can't keep it together. Can't keep it straight. Okay. Yeah, they were particularly heavy in the yes votes. That doesn't mean that these areas shaded in red didn't have yes votes, but they were more heavily focused on the stay with UK votes. And so you can see that down here in the deep red, those are, towards this end of the scale. They tend to be closer to England, which there's the line right there. Let's move my little recorder here. They have this little line right there. That is the English border. And obviously the people there would be more connected to England by just going shopping nearby, or by distance you just understand that area better. You probably have family right across the line, who knows. And so you get a bit more 50-50-ish in here, and then in this middle section, in which is where they have a lot of the heavy population centers always vote sort of opposite to the rural, or typically vote opposite to the rural. And so that's how it's playing out in Scotland as well here. Men and women voting. I'm just double checking my stats. I apologize. Making sure I want to make sure I have to say yes. Women tended to vote more heavily towards the stay with the UK, but not by a massive amount. That was what I want to show you in that particular graphic. And it's interesting, you have this inverse pattern here, where the older you were, the more you voted to stay with the UK, and the younger you were, the more you were likely to vote to strike out on your own, which is kind of the way that life tends to go. People are a bit more willing to take risks when they are younger, and so and they also have more of an affinity for the EU potentially. Maybe they would prefer the ease of going to college in Germany or something like that, which would be easier with a EU being a closer to the EU and rather than not. So there's all sorts of different factors in this, but you see that inverse relationship there, which is always interesting when it comes to how and why people vote in elections. And you can also see the distribution of how people are, where the older folks are in Scotland. So this is a map with 65 and older. And so these darkest areas are those with the oldest population. And so you see, down here and up through here, but it's not a perfect correlation, but it does connect, the age and the location of voting. And they generally voted along the lines of party affiliation, Conservative and SNP, which tend to be the bigger groups in a lot of cases. But Labour tended to vote along with the Conservatives, not completely, but more so than not, which is interesting in itself. Okay, so the issues that we're dealing with here. One is currency. People are debating on what their currency would be. So they currently are using the British pound, but if they choose to break away, would they have a specific Scottish currency, or would they choose to go with the EU, which they probably would try to go with the EU, but there are certain rules and regulations around that. So would they be able to? Who knows? Healthcare. Would they be able to fund a healthcare system on the par with what they're used to? That's the concern. Can they fund their pensions? So this is assuming that all their money kind of goes into the UK pot, and so are they independent enough financially to be able to handle that kind of responsibility on their own as a country if they're not used to doing that on a regular basis? Would they be able to get BBC television? That was a big deal because people are used to BBC since the World Wars, and if it's suddenly stopped, that would be a real problem for people getting information and entertainment. The North Sea oil reserves. They are a very large oil treasury in the world, really, and so who would own it? The UK or the British would prefer to keep it, and the Scottish would prefer to say it's ours and benefit from it. Would they be able to get EU membership is obvious, and what would who would be the monarch of the country? Would the Queen still be, that she technically is and holds both the crowns? Would they want their crown back and choose a new monarch, or would they just skip it and become just a regular constitutional democracy and move on from there? In this whole referendum, the monarch, Queen Elizabeth, remained neutral. As she does in most events, and as all the monarchs do. So it's a very interesting election just for UK purposes, as a sort of a checking the temperature of the people to see where they are on things. And who knows, maybe in another 10 or 20 years, they often are talking about, we need another referendum. The SNP is wanting to vote until they get the results that they want.